Well, good afternoon. Welcome along to the Pastor's Heart and a special edition of the Pastor's Heart this afternoon, an extra edition. Dominic Steele is my name. We're thinking about religious freedom, and we've put on this special episode because religious freedom has been dominating the news in Australia the last few days. Michael Kellahan is with us. He is the Executive Director of Freedom for Faith. And Michael, we've got people watching and listening to us from across Australia, but also Christians around the world. And so I just want to, firstly, before we get into the controversy that we've had in Australia this week, just do some of the background. And I suppose you've got to go back to the same-sex marriage debate late last year. For those who don't know, there was a debate in Australia, a plebiscite, and then same-sex marriage was made law in Australia. And then in the wake of that, the Turnbull government decided to have an inquiry or a report on religious freedom. Just give us the background there.
Yeah, in advance of the vote, they signalled an intention to park really the religious freedom questions. They said people are having a debate around religious freedom. Let's figure out the marriage question and then look at religious freedom. That inquiry was then set up, a panel of legal experts to do that, led by Philip Ruddock, former Attorney General. In terms of reference, are really good. So it's much broader than just LGBT issues and marriage. It's actually a far-reaching look at Commonwealth law, state law. How does it work in Australia? Like, is religious freedom adequately protected? Are there real concerns there or not?
Now, I remember they were calling for submissions over quite a short period of time, over the Christmas period. And then there was an extension of a month or so, but then pretty much the report got back to the government in May, and then there's been nothing for 4 months, or probably there's been lots of stuff behind the scenes, but in terms of the public, there's been nothing.
we have been working on this every day since, I think, December 15th last year.
Right.
And as have others. But yes, so a pretty tight time frame to put something in. But even with that, 16,500 public submissions came in.
That's an extraordinary number.
It's off the charts, yeah. Yeah.
Which shows a lot of people are engaged in the issue. Do you have a sense of how many from we want more religious freedom, how many we want less religious freedom?
Yeah, well, look, it wasn't a
and then I guess different kinds of submissions. Some are just individuals, some are representing constituencies.
Yeah, and it wasn't a vote to kind of say how many are on this side or that. Although I'd love to actually engage someone to properly go through, because I think it'd be a fascinating bit of research. Here are 16,500 opinions about the place of religion in Australia. That's a really important bit of data I would have thought to get to. But my general sense, having read a few hundred, is that overwhelmingly you've got people of goodwill putting them in, so they're not really angry and hostile, and they're majority of them would be Christian submissions coming in, mostly one page, something like that, saying, look, this is a good thing, we're concerned about this. A lot connecting to marriage, but many going well beyond it. And then there's the kind of professional agitators who are putting in
people like yourself, really,
like ourselves. Well, our submission came in at 108 pages, and it was really recognising that they had a short period of time to think through a very complex and contested area. We wanted just to help with that and to say, look, here's some thinking, not to say, this is exactly what you should recommend, but to say, look, here's the broad directions that pick up the concerns of people of faith in the country and that are good for all Australian citizens.
Now, the report was leaked a few days ago. It's kind of come out in quite a messy way, rather than, I'm imagining the government wanted to, well, I've read that the government wanted to release the report when it had worked out its response, but it's come out in a bit of a more higgledy-piggledy way.
Yeah, I mean, the recommendations of the report have come out. We haven't yet seen the full report, although more may come, but that's the nature of leaks. I mean, it's just a fact of political life they need to deal with. Certainly, the question, I mean, from Media Watch this week to the Anglican Archbishop's presidential address, you've seen, significant critiques of the way Fairfax handled that story and whether in fact it was beaten up to make non-issues headlines.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Oh, front page of the Herald is, schools intent on banning gay kids. There's not in any of the submissions, there's no practice of that happening, there's no evidence of that at all, and yet let's find the most controversial thing that could possibly be implied out of the recommendations and splash it across the headline as something that was just it's just not happening.
Okay. Let's just look at the wording of Recommendation 7 and get you to just explain that for us then, because that's really the controversial wording there,
Yeah, I mean, we can try. I mean, I think and happy for you to start us on that. How far we'll go, we'll see.
Sure. We've put it up on the screen here. And so the Commonwealth should amend the Sex Discrimination Act to provide that religious schools may discriminate in relation to students on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or relationship status, provided that the discrimination is founded in the precepts of the religion, the school has a publicly available policy outlining its position in relation to the matter, the school provides a copy of the policy in writing to prospective students and their parents at the time of enrolment, and to existing students and their parents at any time the policy is updated, and the school has regard to the best interests of the child as the primary consideration in its conduct. Do you just want to kind of, what's meant by that?
Well, it's important to say this isn't draft legislation. So this is a recommendation. Here's what we think you should do, and then it's the question of we're still waiting to see what the government says, and then we're still waiting to see what the legislation might say. So in as much as we can talk about a leaked report at all, I mean, I think what it does is it's kind of a restatement of the current law. And the law is complicated because you've got Commonwealth and state levels of anti-discrimination law. But what you have there is the existing law and a recommendation that, the best interest of the child be explicit, which isn't there at the moment, and that there be a policy of disclosure and transparency around it, which I think is a very significant thing in an anti-discrimination space. Like, schools will have to think quite carefully about going out publicly on that and where they stand. But the schools very clearly have said all week, we don't do this. We don't expel gay kids. It's not happening. We're not interested in laws that would let us do that.
So I heard Archbishop Glenn Davies in the Synod of the Anglican Church of Sydney on Monday night, and he was quite clear that I think he said, let's be completely clear, Anglican schools in Sydney do not do this. Yeah.
Yep, Catholics have come out and said the same, and it's just not the case that this is happening.
So why is the recommendation there at all?
Because what they're doing is they're surveying the law, which is on the books. And so what they've done is they've looked at the law, and the law would allow some of these things, even if it's not done in practice. If it's there on the books, then they're looking at it and saying, do you need this law or not? And so there are other examples of that where, the law on blasphemy, say. Let's get rid of the law on blasphemy. It's on the books, but no one's been prosecuted since the 1890s, I think it is. And we don't need it. Church leaders have said they don't need it. They're not interested. So, they will look at laws like that, but you're not going to find blasphemy on the front page of Fairfax. But for me, the disappointment is that this is religious freedom really goes to the heart of the ability of Australians to live together well with different beliefs. And that's something which is substantial and significant, and is, thinking about your audience who's listening here, that's really important, and for it to be distracted and for religious freedom only to be seen through this prism of LGBT, it's very disappointing. Like, we need to think about how those different rights relate. We need to have better conversations around it, but this is not going to help that happen.
Because this feels like it's suddenly got almost hysterical, perhaps because of the Wentworth by-election.
It's a beat up. Well, I don't want to speculate on Wentworth, who knows, and who knows who motivated this and what the motivation is, but yeah, it is what it is.
Can I ask what you made of Tanya Plibersek's tweet, where she was quite strong on this issue on Monday?
Look, I haven't been following her Twitter feed closely enough to kind of comment on that particularly, but I think the critical issue in the conversation that's happened over this week really has been the issue of schools' rights around employment and whether or not schools are going to be able to engage people that are supportive of the faith or hold the faith. And for a distracting conversation on students that was really irrelevant to then be kind of segued into a very significant conversation about employment and teachers is those two should not have happened in the same sentence. Like they're different issues which are being dealt with there. And I understand the frustration that the ALP must feel in that they haven't seen the report and we've been waiting and waiting and waiting. But it would be great to actually have the report out and for us to be able to sit down and say, what are not just the leaked recommendations, but what's the thinking of the expert panel behind it? And then what is the government response? Where do they want to go on this? And for us to have a kind of mature conversation that wasn't done on the run in the news cycle on such significant things. Because of the amount, I mean, as soon as those comments started coming out on teachers yesterday, my phone just started running hot. And not just us. Like there's a depth of concern out there about schools, which I think many in the media and the political class may have just misunderstood, misread. Like that there's a significant depth of concern here, and that these concerns are pretty reasonable once you see the potential impact of some of these changes.
What are some of the other big issues? You've talked about teachers. You've talked about blasphemy. What are some of the other issues in the report?
Oh, look, if the recommendations are right and true, and we think they are, then it's fairly far-reaching. It does go to a number of things. The schools, though, I think rightly is kind of one of the biggest concerns. It's understandable that's been picked up so quickly, and in some ways it's emblematic of the rest, because it goes to that question about who decides the values that we live by, and what are the laws going to be around that, and what's going to be the ability of parents to see their kids raised in the faith. I think that's...
And you're thinking whether it's the Christian faith or a Muslim faith
Absolutely.
or a Baha'i faith or whatever.
Yeah, and even more so probably for some of the minority faiths where the school becomes very much the custodian of a lot of the traditions, that this is the place where we send our Sikh kids in order to have an exposure to the culture, or another school where it'll be an exposure to the language or the sacred texts and so on. Like it becomes a very important part of the community life together, that that our kids are sent to the Jewish school is part and parcel of what it means to be holding the faith for 21st century Jews in Australia. Not all, but many.
What happens from here on in? So you're involved in talks, I'm imagining, with both sides of politics at the moment. What are those conversations?
I'm not going to tell you that. Certainly.
Go on.
No. I mean, we have confidences which we need to respect, but we're definitely bipartisan, right? And so we're trying to offer the best thinking and concerns to both sides, so they can think well and serve the whole nation. Where does it go? It could go 12 different ways before the next election, and we need to be nimble enough to just keep speaking and nudging and stuff where we can. So that's kind of our voice into Canberra. So there's good conversations there, and there's people of goodwill on both sides that are looking at this. But we also have a conversation to the church. I think this is part of it today, which is to say, look, if these are things which the local church is concerned about, then it should be praying. It should be teaching on this. It should be thinking through this. It should be resourcing its members. It should be thinking through what are the implications for the ministry we do. Like if that's built on platforms which are now vulnerable, which may not be there if freedoms are chipped away, then how do we respond to that?
So what are you calling on church leaders to do, ministers who are watching or listening to us now?
Look, I think we're not actually calling for a new thing. I think what we're saying is the church needs to be the church. And if it is, then it's going to pray. 1 Timothy 2, we'll pray for leaders. That we might be able to live quiet and godly lives.
And get on with the business of proclaiming Christ. I guess, unrestricted.
Yeah. And right from Pentecost, you've seen that that's been an issue. There's pressure to always, don't speak that name. Go back upstairs. Don't go out into the public and do this thing anymore. And Christians at that point are always going to dissent. Now, there's got to be wisdom about when to dissent and so on, but if you are following Christ, then there's going to be times when there is pressure and there is conflict. And so pastors are going to have to teach their people about when that moment is and how it is that they respond. And we've got 2,000 years of, practice and legacy to draw on. And how is it that we love our neighbour, and how is it that we're public in the way that we live out the faith and not just play by secular rules? Not just for schools, that's an obvious issue, and we've seen that in the news cycle, but for churches as well, not to just play by secular rules that say, oh sure, you can have all those gospel convictions as long as it's on a Sunday morning, here in Annandale, or a Wednesday night in your home group. But to say, no, actually it affects, my faith comes with me into the workplace, into the school, and I live alongside people with other beliefs, and how does that interaction work? They're really important conversations to have. And in many ways, although a lot of the noise and sound takes place in terms of the media cycle and that debate, and I know your own history there, like a lot of the action in terms of religious freedom is actually in terms of how Christians want to actually live it out. So it's one thing to have a freedom, it's another to exercise it. So an example would be scripture in schools, where New South Wales, we've got wonderful freedoms, and yet every year we struggle to find scripture teachers. We have freedoms at the moment, and we need to think carefully about how we exercise those freedoms and make the most of following Christ in the situation we're in.
How do you, I'm just thinking now on the pastor's heart, and your own heart. I mean, you're a pastor, but you're also involved in this advocacy and these conversations. I'm conflict averse. How do you manage your own heart in the rough and tumble of all of this?
I'm always... The funny thing is, whenever we've gone through a really difficult few days, and things have been tough, in God's kindness, He's kind of sent people the following few days who've said, "I've been praying for you," or these things have been happening. And so to be conscious that actually, we're not in this alone, and that people are praying, and that this is just a way of serving. That's been helpful. And I think too, it's been great for me. Like I've always had a kind of a bent and an interest in thinking theologically about politics and stuff like that. But to be able to do it in this setting is really great, because you realise that, in fact, there's a lot of people of goodwill, I'll say it again, who've come before us and who've thought through some of these issues. And so we can't just be kind of nostalgic about that past, but we can also hear some great wisdom that says, look, fear is not a Christian way of thinking, that we're in changing times, but we're always the people of hope, and what we do now and the way we speak can actually be a genuine blessing to not just the church, but to the whole culture who struggles with thinking through how do you deal with differences? How do we do that?
I've just read the book by the Australian's foreign editor,
Greg Sheridan,
on God is Good for You. He made the point there that although there are fewer Christians in the media than in the general population, there are more Christians in federal parliament, or people of faith in federal parliament, percentage-wise, than the general population. I take it then, or has it been the case, that the reception that you've got from within the walls of Parliament House has actually been reasonably positive?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think, and that's not just limited to those of faith either. I think there are people who don't hold the faith themselves, who say we want something better. We actually want to find good ways to
They see this as people who don't have faith say that the principle of freedom of religion is an important principle to be maintained.
Some, yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's one of those things where it's impossible just to paint black and white. Like,
Yeah.
you know, we've all got our agendas that we bring. But look, I think often people are more willing to listen than sometimes we are to speak. And I think sometimes politicians are rightly frustrated that they're only approached after things come to a vote, you know, and then people are angry. And it's the one conscience issue of the year. One of the things I'll always remember is a comment made by Brendan Nelson, who's now running the War Memorial, but when he was local member, he said that the most significant letter he got was one that came from a Christian who just sent him an email that just said, "I'm just praying for you." And he had he said he had this huge list of mail to get through, which he was reading at the end of a long, long session in Parliament. And it was the only one that didn't ask for something, you know, and didn't come with an agenda. And so for churches to pray for their local members is really significant, and not to necessarily connect that with an agenda or an ask, but to do the thing that we're called to do, to pray, knowing that God appoints rulers and calls on them to judge wisely and to rule well, and for us to support them in that.
Michael Kellahan, thanks for talking to us.
Sure. Thanks.
Michael Kellahan's been my guest on the Pastor's Heart this afternoon, and it's great that you've been able to join us for this program, and we'll look forward to being back with you at our regular time of Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock next week for the Pastor's Heart, and I hope you can join us then. Cheers.